Most Muslims have heard of Aisha. Many have heard of Khadija. But very few know the story of Mariah al Qibtiyyah. And the little that is said about her is often surrounded by confusion. Some people insist everything about her is authentic. Others dismiss the entire story as fabrication. I think both approaches miss the point. So in this video, I want to do something different. Let's separate what is well established from what is disputed, reconstruct the most likely sequence of events from the earliest Islamic sources, and then ask one simple question. Would we expect God's final prophet to accept an enslaved woman as a diplomatic gift and enter into a sexual relationship with her? That is the question I want you to think about. Let's begin with what is historically well established. Mariah al Qibtiyyah was an Egyptian Copt, meaning she belonged to Egypt's Christian Coptic community. After the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, Muhammad sent letters inviting surrounding rulers to Islam. One of those letters reached al-Muqawqis, the governor of Egypt, according to the Islamic historical tradition. He did not become Muslim, but he responded with gifts. Among those gifts, according to the early Islamic historical tradition accepted by Muslim historians, were Mariah and her sister Sirene. Mariah then entered Muhammad's household. This is one of the points that sometimes surprises both Muslims and non-Muslims. Mariah was almost certainly not one of Muhammad's wives. The overwhelming classical understanding is that she was his concubine, later becoming an Walad after giving birth to Muhammad's son Ibrahim. That distinction matters historically. It is also well established that Mariah gave birth to Ibrahim, Muhammad's last son. Muhammad reportedly loved him deeply. Sadly, Ibrahim died as a toddler, and authentic Hadith describe Muhammad openly grieving his son's death. Those facts are not particularly controversial. The controversies begin with Surah At-Tahrim. There are two major explanations preserved in the Islamic tradition for why the opening verses of Surah 66 were revealed. The first is the famous honey incident. This explanation appears in Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim and therefore carries very strong Hadith support in the Sunni tradition. The second explanation involves Mariah. This is where many discussions become confusing. Some people say the Mariah story has no basis whatsoever. That is not true. Others speak as though every detail is unquestionably authentic. That also goes too far. Here's what we can actually say. There is an authentic narration in Sunan an-Nisa'i, Hadith 3959, rated Sahih, describing Muhammad having relations with one of his slave women. The narration says that Aisha and Hafsa continued pressuring him until he prohibited her for himself. And then the opening of Surah At-Tahrim was revealed. O Prophet, why do you prohibit what Allah has made lawful for you? Notice something very important. The Hadith itself does not explicitly name Mariah. However, major classical commentators commonly identified this unnamed slave woman as Mariah al Qibtiyyah. That distinction is important. The authenticated narration establishes the core event. The identification with Mariah comes through classical tafsir and historical interpretation. Now let's move on to the next layer. Reports found in early tafsir works, especially those preserved by At-Tabari, add further details. These reports describe Muhammad being in Hafsa's residence with Mariah, Hafsa discovering what happened, Muhammad asking her to keep the matter private, and the disagreement eventually leading into the revelation of Surah At-Tahrim. These reports have been discussed for centuries. They are historically important, but they do not have the same level of authentication as the narration in Sunan an-Nasa'i. So if we reconstruct the story carefully, here's what I think is the most reasonable conclusion. Mariah existed. She entered Muhammad's household after being sent from Egypt. She became his concubine. She bore him his son Ibrahim. An authentic narration states that Muhammad prohibited a slave woman to himself after pressure from Aisha and Hafsa, and that Surah At-Tahrim was revealed in connection with that event. Classical Muslim commentators commonly identify that slave woman as Mariah. The more dramatic details, exactly where the encounter occurred, whether Hafsa personally caught them, and the precise conversation afterward come from weaker reports and should be treated more cautiously. I think that's the fairest historical reconstruction. Now comes the question that matters most. People often argue over chains of narration. They debate which report is stronger. They compare tafsir with hadith. Those are worthwhile discussions, but they are not the central issue. The central issue is moral. Even if we set aside every disputed detail, even if we remove every weak narration, even if we rely only on what is broadly established, we are still left with this picture. An Egyptian Christian woman entered Muhammad's household. After being sent as a diplomatic gift, she became his concubine. She later bore him a son. For me, that raises a profound moral question. Yes, rulers in the 7th century exchanged enslaved human beings. History is full of practices that were once common. But Muhammad is not presented in Islam as an ordinary 7th century ruler. He is presented as God's final prophet. The question then is not whether ancient societies practiced slavery. The question is whether the greatest moral example for humanity should have accepted an enslaved woman as a gift in the first place. If God wanted to provide humanity with a timeless moral example, is this really the example we should expect? That is the question I cannot escape, and it brings me to one final fact that I think is worth remembering. Mariah did not first meet Muhammad as a free woman. According to the traditional Islamic historical account accepted by Muslim scholars, she entered his household because another ruler sent her as a diplomatic gift. Whether someone ultimately believes Islam is true or false, that historical claim deserves to be confronted honestly, and for me it is one of the most morally significant episodes in Muhammad's life, and one that every serious student of early Islam should understand.